Good morning, and welcome to the third and final event in our homeless strand. I'm Val McDermid, and I'm chairing this session where we'll be talking about the many forms homelessness can assume. I'd like to thank the Open University in Scotland for their support of this event. The work they do with people who've had their life chances shattered by homelessness is invaluable. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to ask the award-winning poet, playwright and spoken word artist Joelle Taylor to start us off with a piece called Gutter Girls.
Okay, brilliant. Hello, good morning everyone. Isn't that nice when you reply? Makes it a little bit easier. So I'm going to read a few sections from a piece called Gutter Girls, which was commissioned by the Orwell Prize in a response to Down and Out in London and Paris. And they took 3 London poets and 3 Parisian poets and we reinterpreted it. I was, I think, the only poet who had been homeless and was rough sleeping. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how women use their bodies. 1. Poor women. Our bodies are factories. We stand numb-lipped, staring at conveyor belts of beds passing beneath us, a carousel of scribbled sheets, of unwashed mornings, insincere sunsets, red as the lit end of God's cigarette. He's been around here again, but none of us girls will genuflect genitals to him now, and still we stand curbside, the street passing beneath us as we check each walker on for the correct parts. Each bed is a door to a home you do not own. Open it. You are lucky to have this body. Your body is currency. Your skin is wallet. Your body a factory. Men crowd your doorway, desperate for sleep, for a mother to bury themselves in. Your body is cemetery. 2. Poor women. We keep the dark in our mouths, tied up by an old thread of rope. We have swarms of fox building at the backs of our throats, wild cats quietly watching you from behind thickets of teeth. Fear us. It is simpler. And if my body is a house, it's a Soho club. Derelict. 4 a.m., the catchy dark, smoke circles that you can lasso a thin dog with. Anything might happen here. Strangers meet in me and admire the wallpaper. Tap tables waiting for a drink their father knew. And that same jazz singer has been caught in the same riff on repeat since 1967. There is no leaving when you enter my body. I have you now. You who thought you were taking, I took you. You are here still, listening to that old jazz just before it ejaculates, a smoke ring around your neck. You're a very good boy, but I guess you know that now. My body is filled with sleeping men, all tucked up tight and waiting for morning. It will never come. My boys, my beautiful boys. 3. Poor women. We steal from ourselves, all of us criminals, the heart's petty thievery. You can see it in the ruff and scuffle of her, the tide marks around her mouth. Dodging a Russian roulette of semi-loaded kisses. Which one has your name on it? Which one will let you leave tomorrow? I've stolen everything I wear today. This shirt, crisp as a court notice, this tie taken from my sleeping father, the signet ring the center of a small girl's eye. Before everything changed, I stole everything I ate that night, and this face too, taken while the cashier's back was turned. I shoplifted my smile, the skin I ordered from a catalogue and never paid. 4. Poor women. We carry our own coffins. Say we have no use for flowers, love. We've wreaths of lottery tickets and tick books. Instead, plant the seeds caught between our teeth. We build our caskets out of our chipboard bed bases, crowdfund the cremation, pick the ceremony from a Littlewoods catalogue play. Now that's what I call funeral music to the dearly, to the gathered, to the father of the bride, to the men lined like pints of bitter on a bar. Poor women, we bite the head off the wake, awaken in strangers' beds, a small congregation of pills beside us, white faces raised in mourning. In Revelation, there is no death, just less of this. My body is a cemetery anyway. Poor women, we say, it's just how she would have wanted it. No fuss, eyeing the empty, the ashtray eyes, cigarette spirits, the ghosts of your brothers. We don't look behind us at the deserted pews. We did not invite God, but someone said they saw him anyway. Little, well-washed boy, he should know better than to turn up today. God is a bailiff. Poor women are born into a death so soft, so luxurious, so fine woven that life is almost worth it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Joelle, for providing us with that injection of energy. Now, say the word homeless, and for most of us, the image that springs to mind is of a rough sleeper, a beggar on our streets with a sleeping bag, a cup for our loose change, a handwritten placard, and maybe a dog. But that's only the tip of the iceberg of true homelessness. Homelessness goes far beyond people living on the street. You can be homeless with a roof over your head, but if it's not a safe and secure and appropriate roof, then you're suffering from the same disease. You can be defined as homeless if you're sleeping on the streets, if you're sofa surfing with friends and family, if you're staying in a hostel or a refuge or a bed and breakfast hotel, if you're living in overcrowded conditions, if you're living in fear of violence in your home, if you're living in the sort of appalling conditions that have a profound impact on your health, if you're sick or disabled and your home isn't suitable for you. That's what life is like for around a sixth of the UK population. A sixth of our people whose life chances are constricted and constrained. A sixth of our people whose lives are pushed to the margins. They don't feel part of anything. They're outsiders. They're homeless, both in the literal and the metaphorical sense. If we classified homelessness as an illness, because it's like an illness in terms of the devastation it causes in the lives of those who suffer from it, if we classified homelessness as an illness, there would be a public outcry. It would be the lead story on the news. If homelessness was an illness, we'd be demanding a cure. We'd be outraged that this was happening here, that this was happening now. This is this week's big issue. These are the 9 people who have occupied the housing ministry over the last 9 years. Only 2 of them have been in post for more than 2 years. Is it any surprise that nothing much has changed? That all that's happened is things have got worse? The theme of this year's Edinburgh International Book Festival is we need new stories. One of the key reasons for that is that the only way we can understand other lives, other needs, other problems, is to be able to picture their reality. But we can't just picture things in a vacuum. We need the raw material to feed our imagination. Stories, whether they're true or made up by people like me, those are the raw materials we can use to penetrate the surface of news and fake news. Imagining change is the first step on the road to enacting it. That's the angry rant over. I'm joined by 3 writers who have all written about the impact on our life chances of homelessness. Danny Dorling is a human geographer whose work has been described as building up an extraordinary picture of poverty and wealth in contemporary Britain. He's the Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at Oxford University and is a fellow of more distinguished bodies than I have time to list. In his inaugural lecture, he spoke about the increasing disparity between Britain's richest 1% and the rest. His latest book, Peak Inequality, is a jaw-dropping account of the destructive events of wealth distribution in the UK. Geetha Marcus is a sociologist of education and a senior lecturer at Queen Margaret University here in Edinburgh. Originally from Singapore, Geetha previously taught in schools in Scotland. Her study for the Scottish Parliament, Closing the Attainment Gap in 2016, set out innovative international approaches to attaining educational achievement and equality. Her recent book, Gypsy and Traveller Girls, Silence, Agency and Power, deals with lives that are generally hidden from most of us. And Joelle Taylor is a writer who uses various forms to tell her stories: poetry, plays, spoken word performance and blogging. Her latest poetry collection is Songs My Enemy Taught Me, and she's currently completing her first short story collection, The Night Alphabet, which will be published later this year. Her work focuses on the lives of marginalised women and draws on her own experiences as well as the stories of others. She says, "I write because I do not know how not to. In some ways, the words write me." So please welcome Danny Dorling, Geetha Marcus and Joelle Taylor. I want to start by exploring further what I said about the nature of homelessness. Danny, last year I read a piece you'd written about homelessness for the London Review of Books that truly shook me. Can you tell us what your recent research has uncovered about the extent of homelessness in the UK?
I'll have a go. I'm very glad there's a lot of people here. I had a great fear that this would be half empty, and the reason I had that fear was way back in 1995, I went to the United States for the first time, and there was a big geography conference of 5,000 geographers in San Francisco. And the first shock I had was arriving in San Francisco in 95 and having to step over living bodies of homeless people on the street because there were so many, and you'd never seen it before. We had homelessness in Britain, but nothing like America. And the second shock was I was speaking in a session on poverty and homelessness in the USA, and they'd booked a theatre that would take 1,000 of these 5,000 geographers, and just 7 people turned up because they'd become used to it. And this is my big fear. What's happened in the last few years has been shocking. You're still shocked, otherwise you wouldn't be here. The danger is we become used to what's going on. I count things. I have an obsession with counting things. 20 years ago, I was involved in working out that the average life expectancy of both men and women at that time on the streets was 42. Last night, I left the Southside pub at 11:30 with my friends Stacey and Bill. I stopped counting when I got to 14 homeless people before I got to the train station, which is only about 150 meters. We have huge numbers of numbers. We kind of think that counting will solve things. That maybe the most shocking one is, in London alone, 250,000 young adults under 25 are sleeping somewhere which is not their home. Very often the sofa of a friend or somewhere else, mostly not on the streets, often B&B, but very often somebody else's home where that person, because they're human, are putting them up because they know otherwise they will be out. 250,000 in London. It's just kind of unbelievable where it's got to. As you know, there's been a huge rise of people on the streets and people being evicted by landlords. This is the main reason for the rise, is eviction by private landlords. 2% of people are now experiencing acute homelessness, which is the same proportion of us who are serious private landlords. At the extremes in cities like this and my home city of Oxford, the very last, most squalid little flat is now occupied by a university student. You know, if you're wondering what has happened at the extremes, the people who are in a really bad way, in the past, there would be some very nasty rogue landlord who would have put them in a damp tenement. But they've gone, they've been taken. It's partly taken not because we haven't got enough homes. We've been building homes, but more importantly, we've been adding bedrooms to our homes. So we now have more bedrooms in this country than we've ever had before per person.
Wow.
There's places where we could do with building some more, and we need to build for an elderly population. But the homelessness problem hasn't been caused by a lack of building, at least for bedrooms. There are more bedrooms in private homes in London than there are people. If nobody wanted to share a bed with anybody else in London, there's still a bed for everybody. So there are lots and lots, more and more empty beds. That's the main thing that's been going on. And one of the reasons, the one I'll end with on this, is how we've dealt with the distribution of our housing. And we've managed in the last 30 years to make our housing less and less and less efficient. The most efficient form of housing in the past, the one where people were most neatly packed in, was council houses and social housing. For a very obvious reason, you don't get allocated a home that's bigger than you need when you apply for a home. So going back to London, if you were a family of 4, 2 parents, 2 children, you would be given a maisonette. And if the children were of opposite sexes and one was aged over 10, you might even have one with 3 bedrooms. But otherwise, 2 bedrooms, kids share, you share. You then do right to buy, because of course you do right to buy, because you get a 40% discount because you've been in so long. And then you sell it. And the person who buys that maisonette, which used to house 4 people, is a landlord. And that landlord then puts that maisonette up on the private market. And the person who invariably ends up living there is a single young professional who is very upset that they have to live in the next council maisonette with a sign outside saying no ball games. Except there aren't any children anymore on the estate to play ball games. And that's the way, doing that kind of thing, as well as allowing people to build property in cities which they never occupy or just occupy for part of the week. We have all the homes we actually need. If we begin to work out ways in which to help people who own 7 properties to decide that they only need to own 5 or 4 or 3 or 2, and to help people who are occupying very large homes just on their own, to encourage them to move to something that suits them better. And there are lots of ways in which you can do this. You can alter the housing market so the faster you get out of that house, the better off your grandchildren will be, because it won't carry on escalating in value. This is a terrible problem. It's the worst in all of Europe. There is only one other country in Europe which has a homelessness rate as high as us, and that is Germany. And the only reason that Germany has a homelessness rate, including on the streets, almost identical to us, is because Merkel let in 1.5 million Syrian refugees without having a plan. And some of those Syrian refugees are homeless. Once you take the Syrian refugees out, their homelessness rate halves in Germany. There are other countries in Europe with nobody sleeping rough. It's entirely possible to avoid this. We don't even need to build to solve the problem. So the really interesting question, when you held up the picture of the housing ministers, you don't go through 9 housing ministers with everything getting worse every year without it being the truth that they really don't actually care. I think we've got to begin to accept at this point, it's not a cock-up. It's not some accident. We are governed by people who believe that the threat of having to live on the streets is a useful threat to get people to behave, and we should be looking, people who believe that we should be looking at the United States as the way forward, who are not shocked by thousands of bodies on the streets, living bodies in the United States, who are not shocked by how many people sleep in a car because they don't have a home, who think that this is the bright new future for the United Kingdom, and that's where we should be going, because most people are feckless and they have to be threatened with the idea of going hungry and losing their home if they don't do the kind of work that those people at the top want them to do. That's where we've got to now. It's gone on long enough, and we've got to accept it's not a mistake. They know exactly what they're doing.
I suppose in some ways the irony is that the Brexit they are inflicting on us is driving down the prices of their property investments in London.
Yes.
So perhaps some of those properties will actually return to the market and be occupied by people who need somewhere to sleep, as opposed to somewhere to park their money.
Or, I mean, in the past, when the house prices fell in the 1970s, local authorities picked up property at auction at the very bottom. And the brilliant thing about that is when the local authority bought these properties, they became council homes. But nobody could tell it's a council home. It's not in the council estate. I would be planning for that again. A hard Brexit's a terrible thing. But if it absolutely collapses our housing market, there are opportunities for a new government. And don't believe this is impossible. In Japan, the house prices fell around about 1990 in 1 year by 50%. Right? This kind of thing does happen. It's an extreme event. But don't see it I want something softer than this. I'm, an old middle-aged academic. I worry about the medicines and the food. Although very kindly Ireland has said they'll send us food. But all those Chinese and Saudi and Russian investors who's been building those tower blocks near the river in London, they're built, and it's not beyond the wit of a decent housing minister to work out how to get people in them. You essentially tax the hell out of anybody who has an empty flat. And you'd be amazed how quickly they will put people in that property. All tax the hell out of it so it's suddenly not an investment worth having anymore. It's quite good they've been built. I'm quite glad they're there. Very well located, nicely done up. Ready.
Should be used.
Yeah.
Geetha, when we were talking about this event, you made the very strong point that in your work with Romani women, you came to understand that home is not something that means the same to all of us. And there's an issue over who decides what kind of home we get. I'd like to hear more about that.
Sure. So the women, the young women that I worked with are not Romani. They are Scottish Gypsy and Scottish travellers. They may have some Romani blood, as in, through intermarriage centuries ago with Roma from Europe, but many of these women have Celtic origins. So gypsies and travelers have lived in this country arguably since the 12th century. But I'll come to that in a minute, if I may, because I'd like to add to what you've said. And so I think that this idea of homelessness, and by the way, gypsies and travelers do not consider themselves homeless people. I need to make that very clear on their behalf. Some of them may be homeless, but they don't see their lifestyle as one of homelessness. They have different concepts of what a home is. But homelessness and our understanding of home, I think, sits within a complex and contradictory pool of events which impact on mental and emotional well-being daily. And I'd like to put this in the historical context, because what we're seeing today, we think maybe happened a few years ago because of austerity since 2008. But historically, I think we ought to be mindful of the searing legacy and impact of empire, slavery, and multiple wars fought in foreign shores. Modernity is marked by relentless catastrophe, and this, coupled with the dehumanizing effects of extreme capitalism that we see today, and the dehumanizing regimentation of daily existence for some sections of our society, is crippling us. There are moral panics and fears about various groups of itinerants and folk devils alongside the racialized other, has existed for centuries, actually. And since then, we have been, as Marx would put it, recycling the same old crap to control, coerce, and flush out, one of Theresa May's favorite terms, various bodies of people, creating a pattern of long-standing hostile environment policies. This is not new. And so within the coarseness of our time we live in today, I think there continues to be state-sponsored, structural, institutional, and cultural violence reflected in the expulsion of the Windrush generation, Grenfell, the rise of anti-immigrant sentiments, the use and misuse of detention centers for asylum seekers and refugees, the rise in stop and search, targeting black men in particular, Islamophobia, particularly the rise in attacks on Muslim women, rise in anti-Semitism, the role of the media, certain sections of the media, in spreading hate, the universal credit system, the incarceration of our young people with mental health issues, rising childhood poverty across the board, not just affecting the white working class. As Audre Lorde, a queer black feminist, said, there is no hierarchy of oppressions. Each of the above, which I've cited, is a news story. Each stings a different group, but knit them together and a far darker picture emerges. I believe Britain is being stripped of its social infrastructure, the institutions that make up her daily life. So our social infrastructure, never mind the physical infrastructure, up and down the country continues to be decimated through hostile policies that wage war against our own people. People need to have nobility and dignity in their lives. This is a human right, and they need other people to also recognize it in them. So gypsies and travelers, coming back to that, fall into this category of centuries of persecution, beginning from in 1530 with the Egyptian Act that declared that any person who was caught to be a gypsy in Scotland and in England would face the death penalty. There have been successive policies over centuries targeting gypsies and travelers. And as one author put it, it's the last bastion of acceptable racism in this country. It's the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. I go to conferences on racism in Scotland or in the UK, and the plight or the experiences of gypsy travelers is not even in people's imagination. They're not even discussed. People still don't know who they are, where they are, whether they're in amongst us, how many there are in this country, in Scotland. Something from 4,500 gypsies and travelers to 20,000. And part of the problem is that the gypsies, many of the gypsies and travelers that I met, the young women and their families, are terrified of self-identifying. They will not fill in the census form because they are afraid of what can be done to them by the state. They're hugely distrustful of the state. So I am actually I'm shocked. I continue to be shocked by some of the things that are going on in this country, affecting not just the homeless, but many, many different sections of our society that we forget about. But I'm not surprised. I'm shocked, but I'm not surprised. And many of the young women I met, and in all of these people that I mentioned, these communities, it affects you depending on whether you are a woman. It affects you if you are disabled in a particular way. It adds added pressure if you are queer or have issues to do with your sexuality. So it works on many levels, So when you're a child, it affects you, I think, worst of all, really.
Okay. And and of course, there is that sense of the state decides what a home is.
That's
so
right.
The way of life of other people, like travellers, is not regarded as having a proper home because you move around, you live on wheels, as it were, and so somehow this is not a home. And other people decide what is the definition of a home. Joelle, I believe you've had direct experiences of being without a secure home.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that from your own experience and how you managed to turn your own life around?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very long process. So I come from what we would call decent working class Northern English family, with both parents working. But even when I was a child, at the age of 5, my It was in the 70s. My mum and dad both lost their jobs. We lost our home and were put up in a B&B in Blackpool. And that made me very vulnerable at that time. I was sexually abused while I was in that space because there wasn't kind of the right safety monitors. And this kind of, that's a bit of information required because there's a huge number of the women on the streets have been sexually abused. I think it's something like 18%, probably higher, of women on the streets have been sexually abused as children, as opposed to about 5% of males. So I left home and went to university. I was the first in my family. It was a big bloody deal. And I went to university and was fine for the first year, but it was before grants and loans. So what happened was you were given a certain amount of money by the local authority, and then your parents were supposed to top up. Now, my parents weren't very into the idea of university anyway, not for a woman, believe it or not. And so I had accommodation in halls for a year, but no money to eat. So I became a fabulous petty thief. That was the first thing that happened. I met my first ever middle-class people, which was very exciting, who would go out every night and they'd have meals together and that kind of thing, where else I was scrubbing around trying to steal things. I was stealing a lot. I stole books because, of course, if you don't have money, then you can't be educated. It's pre-internet, so there's literally, your qualifications were dependent on what you were reading. So I stole, and then I stole to order. And then I left university. They tried to kick me out because I had nowhere to live. And I was like, okay, so I've lost my home, I've lost my family, and I'm going to lose my fucking degree. Thank you. That's really helpful. And so I then started sleeping within the corridors of university, running around from space to space. I learned to cook, and I'm a brilliant cook now, thank you. Poverty for that, thank you. Because I would go to these middle-class kids and be like, I shall cook you dinner, but let me eat some of it as well. And then I left university and its relative safety, and that's when it truly began. And I went from working class to underclass very, very quickly, watching all my friends go off and get amazing jobs with all their contacts, whilst I was rough sleeping, and eventually it led into sex work. Now look at me, I'm a shit sex worker. Seriously, I didn't know what was going on, you know? So I became a thing called a lady's maid. And that is basically the person who sits in these porter cabin bordellos, used to be around the back of King's Cross Station, just sits there really nervously. And I was incredibly thin. I was diagnosed anorexic, not because I wanted this whole idea, the myth of how you want to look. It's like, there's no bloody food. And then my job was to check each walker on, like I said in the poem, somebody coming in to make sure that they were safe. I hadn't a clue. The whole space was really, really unsafe. So that led to that, and I often say this, and it's quite a contentious thing to say, but what saved my life was drugs. And that can seem a very contentious thing to say when we're talking about rough sleeping and homelessness, but the drug economy is a counter-economy. And if you've got an ounce of weed, you know you can get some money, if you like. And it's kind of more like a bartering system. So it's not like you make money like you have the films, you big drug dealer drowning in money. It's literally like you exchange drugs for sugar, you know, and it's this kind of system that goes on. And also it introduces you to a different kind of underclass world in which you're kind of all protecting each other in a way. It's very dangerous. You become very ill, very paranoid very quickly. And obviously you're constantly weighing liberty against dinner. That's literally it. So that was my own experiences, and how I was very lucky because this was in the late 80s, early 90s, when the LGBTQ scene, the lesbian and gay scene at the time, was very powerful in London, and we had a whole system of squats. We used to go squatting, so there were a bunch of women in Bethnal Green who took me in, and then you'd move to another squat and set things up. Now, they don't have it. Young women like me don't have that kind of protective community of squatting that we used to have. I was 32 years old with a first-class degree before I found my first home, before I didn't use my body to be able to sleep, you know, have somewhere safe to be, before, you know, I didn't trade myself like I was currency. That's appalling, and it's a true story, and it's what it does to you inside. You know, and part of the reason I'm a writer, I always say as well, I learned to write in the door queue. because, you know, you have these long queues and the way they look at you when you're signing your name. And I would be like, I'm going to fucking write a best-selling book, bitch. Then I'll sign my name.
Yeah.
You know, and you have to try to translate that. And the way I processed the extreme poverty and sexual abuse was, this is all research and development, you know. So that was my particular story. And also, I just want to say, Val, I think I said a little bit in the email to you, but I am thrilled and feel very privileged to be invited onto this, because talking about my past, which is a personal grief in such a positive space, is mind-blowing for me. So thank you.
Well, thank you. The truly terrible thing is, though, that for every person who has a story like you, of having escaped from that and built a life, there are thousands who don't, for all sorts of reasons. And that's the thing that's out there today, every day, that surrounds us.
Yeah.
How did we get to this place? We're supposed to be the 5th richest economy in the world, and yet we have a 1/6 of our population living on a cliff edge. I just can't get my head round how we can have created a society like this. And I'd like to ask all three of you, really, how do we get past this crisis? How do we start to address it? What are the steps we can take? Is it up to the state, or do we as individuals have ways that we can help to address this?
I mean, I think what Danny was saying was quite shocking. I nearly started crying when you were talking, because it really compounds the idea. This is ideological. This doesn't need to happen. So the first thing is acknowledging this is an ideology, and we're being forced into this to create workers for this hyper-capitalist system, you know. But I think there's a real danger in us taking it in as individuals, because this needs to be our government, our state doing this. You know, we've got individuals running food banks, but like, it's becoming, like Danny said, and this idea that it's really normal. We don't see it anymore because it's so normalized.
Go on.
Sorry, I mean, sometimes when I think about these things, and I do think about these things a lot because of my job, I just think, I don't know what we can do. You know, what do we do? I am just one person. How does one person fight this kind of system that really gets its claws into people's lives? But I think that more and more, unfortunately, I'm losing faith in the state, and us looking to the state to provide us with what we need, to help us to redistribute resources. I think that really if we really want to do something about this, it perhaps has to come bottom up. And so if you live in Old Town, you have an Old Town community action group that looks after your needs, including those of anybody who's rough sleeping, a young person needing help, someone on drugs, whatever. You look after your community. If you live in Pilrig, you have a Pilrig community action group that looks after the needs of the people in your community. My understanding of homelessness is that when the linchpin is the family. So if for whatever reason a person is having a problem or suffering or whatever it might be, the family is the last, perhaps, safety net. If that family cannot provide support, or will not provide support, or is the problem itself, then what's left? What's left is the community. And if that's not there as well, because as I said before, the social infrastructure is also being eroded, what's then left for any individual who needs support? So I actually think we need to build communities of support, so that those communities can then support the families, so that the families can then support the individuals. I think it needs to be bottom up. I'm done waiting for the people at the top to fix things.
Yeah. Danny?
I'm generally optimistic. which may sound odd to you, but it's partly because I'm a person who counts things. And usually, when you are the very worst out of 28 countries, and when things have got this extreme, they tend to get better, because it's actually very, very hard to maintain that position. It takes a lot of work to do it, a lot of political donations to a particularly nasty party. That particularly nasty party, to give us an example, our Conservative Party left the normal European Conservatives in 2014 and allied itself with Alternative for Deutschland. Right, that's the country we are living in. The state can and does do incredible things. Our state has, in the 60s and 70s, it did. We managed to get rid of soup kitchens that we had in the 30s. There was a time when there were no soup kitchens and no food banks. The first food banks began, I think, in the 90s. So there was a time when people really could eat. And there was a time of full employment, which I can just about remember. When states have real crises, they can do incredible things. So in Germany, if you're a gypsy or traveller, you have a right to stop wherever you like in Bavaria. Many Germans don't know why, which is quite amazing. But that can happen. And just two things to give you a bit of optimism at the moment. The Shadow Housing Minister, John Healey, who I think has been Shadow Housing Minister for, I think, at least 8 years, was a Blairite, managed to stay in there. He's moved quietly. He announced a couple of years ago, and perhaps he should have kept quiet, but he announced the housing policy of Labour, which included the compulsory purchase of land on the edge of cities in need of housing at agricultural price. Within months of him announcing that, Oxford colleges who owned land on the edge of Oxford began immediately to try to see if they could sell their land to developers for the first time in hundreds of years. So if any of you are thinking there's no chance of anything changing, why would the governing bodies of these colleges who've been holding on to this land suddenly work out, oh, there's a risk here? Now the sad thing is the developers who are trying to develop the land want to build big detached houses with double garages for people who will drive to London, right? Which they swarmily tell you in public meetings in Oxford will be housing for your children. And I attended one of these meetings and I put my hand up and said, it won't be for my children. And the man looked at me with pity, assuming I was poor. So that's the situation we're currently at. Another one to give you some optimism. We're currently at our lowest rate of non-dom taxpayers, I think, ever since we started the non-dom, because they've left or disappeared, because they're frightened of what might happen to them. Yeah, you may, when things are really bad, you think nothing can get better. But we have made it so bad for so many people that it's possible. I'll give you one last set of numbers because I don't think you'll believe in me, and you won't believe me on this one at all, because it's not what the press tell you. The European elections in May, if you add up our far-right political parties, the definition of far-right being to the right of European conservatives, the EPP, the big bloc in Europe, we send by far the highest number of far-right MEPs to the European Parliament. We are far-right central. We send over 40-odd. The far-right parties being the Conservatives, UKIP and Brexit. Over time, the proportion of people voting for those parties since our first European election around about 1979, I think, it was 0, 0.1 for the NF, then it went up and up and up. 2014 European election, 52% of the population voted for a party that was to the right of European conservatives. We should have seen where we were. In May 2019, the combined far-right parties, Brexit, UKIP and the Tories, lost 11 European seats. That is by far the biggest fall in far-right voting across the entire continent of Europe since the EU began. Now, nobody tells you that. Nobody says, look, something's changed in this country, because Labour lost 10 seats at the same time. But there is a sense of something changing. The elections since Brexit have been incredible. The 2017 election, unprecedented political swing. that we've never seen. The local elections in May, the Tories lost 3,000 seats. The Brexit Party comes up from nowhere, started by Catherine Blakelock last year. She was a student in my department in the 1970s. Theresa May, another student in my department. You know, it's our fault. Boris luckily didn't go to the college I'm at. But the funniest, I mean, just to end, I mean, if you Google Oxford University Prime Ministers, you will find my university's page of celebration of our Prime Ministers. I think more than 20. And they're kind of these really dodgy old aristocrats and then some other ones and so on. But they kind of look regal. And then at the top of the page, there's this picture of this man which spoils the entire thing. You know, you can be afraid of him, but I think Boris Johnson is actually our best bet to realise what it is we've got to. I think as things unfold in the coming weeks, people will take a look at the country and think, and you have all these kind of arguments about what you do, but the core is that 40% down to 30% who will loyally vote Conservative because they will look after their house prices are going to begin to lose confidence. It's happened before, it can happen again. It happened in 1990 after the house price crash of '89. The Conservatives lost control of most of the outer London boroughs. Tories didn't vote Labour, they don't do that. They just didn't vote. The best way, house prices falling, a sense that your little nest egg that you've built up isn't safe anymore, that's the kind of thing that results in dramatic change. You do want to do local action. It's the only thing that works in Oxford. It's Muslim women who are supplying the food to the homeless. It's really quite interesting. One of them got an MBE this year. The irony of the whole thing is dramatic, right? And that's how people get fed and sheltered. It's local action outside the state. But you need the state for the big things. You cannot have a social housing sector without the state being involved. Otherwise, you're relying on charity housing, and it doesn't work. We can look across the continent. If you want to see really good housing, look at Vienna for how they do it. You can look at the Netherlands for how they do it, or you can look at Finland. There used to be thousands of people homeless in Helsinki, and it's cold. There's now nobody on the street in Helsinki. There are lots of people in toilets, public toilets, sleeping in Helsinki. But at least those public toilets are heated. We have a continent which shows us ways of doing this well and ways of doing it worst. We just happen to be in the place that is doing it worst, but we are at least providing a service to the rest of Europe by showing them how not to do it.
How shit it can be.
Yeah, that's right.
We're going to close with Joelle doing another bit of poetry, but just before we do that, very quickly, since this is a literary festival, we should maybe say a little bit about writing, but you all use the written word to communicate your knowledge and your experience of the world. What have you learned about the power of stories in shaping our future?
They connect us. Like I was saying earlier, the privilege of being able to speak about a personal story, and then I think if you control language, if you control stories, then you kind of control some kind of outcome. You control yourself, and you make these strong connections with other people. And it's not necessarily in the moment. For me, the greatest things about literary events are what's going to happen next. Not just the book signing, but the conversations we're going to have. And like Geetha was saying, those are the things that kind of community coming together that literature can provide. It's a bridge. Words are a bridge between people, you know, and it's the way we know how to communicate.
It's really tricky, stories of homelessness. I'm not as brave as you, so I hardly ever talk about myself or my own experiences. Homelessness is very interesting on this one, at least to me. We had 6 homeless deaths, more than 6, in my city around about Christmas. And homelessness is a bit like suicide, in that the families are really, really, really upset by it. And so you try with suicide, you try to find a way of writing down accidental death on the death certificate rather than suicide. With homelessness, with the people who died, it was only the young woman whose mother was no longer alive whose story was fully told. The mothers of these are local people who grew up in Oxford who died, the mothers did not want their child's death to be labelled as a homeless death. And so one reason why things are so bad, I've known people who've been homeless. We don't talk about it because it's very personal about people's lives. You will, some of you have been homeless, far more of you will have had a child who's homeless or a cousin who's homeless or somebody else. The stories are very effective. I don't know the way of telling them because of this embarrassment about the families. And I could tell you awful stories of what's happened in the last 12 months that I know, but because they feel personal to other people, I keep it quiet. That shows you the power of stories, but also the difficulty of how do you actually tell them when it's this near to the bone.
I mean, when I first started this project, looking into the lives of gypsy travelers and gypsy traveler women, I really knew very little about gypsies and travelers. And as I got to know them, I was really quite amazed by their resilience, their love for one another, their sense of community and family. They look after their own, you know, and the girls that I met had incredible love and respect for their parents, almost to the extent of realizing that their life choices in their own community was limited. But they were doing this because they were trying to preserve a way of life that they felt could easily be threatened and subsumed by the majority dominant culture. And so this is why many of them choose to be separate, do not wish to involve themselves with other people, carry on living the lives that they want to. So this is where this whole idea of community for me comes from, because I actually was quite surprised to see communities of people who are managing to cope with each other and to support one another in a way that was really very refreshing in this day and age. It's been a huge privilege for me to gain access to very closed community or very private. They know that there's all sorts of terrible things said about them in the media daily. So it's been a real privilege to get to meet them, and I hope I did them justice in the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joelle, take it away.
Okay, so I'm going to do a more of a spoken word piece. I founded the National Youth Slams of this country 18 years ago, and I met a young boy there. His name is Thomas Kareem Crosby, aka Pace, and I mentored him for many, many years. And he came to work for me as a poet coach as well. It's Poetry Slam I'm talking about, by the way. And one minute he was on Blue Peter with me, or performing in the middle of the North Sea on a pontoon, true story, or teaching Disney how to beatbox. We can't beatbox. And then he lost everything. He lost his home. And he was cycling at the age of 27 to sign on at a hostel when he lost faith and got off his bicycle and hung himself. This is for him, and it's for all of you who have suffered. Just remember to keep fucking going. It's called Everything You've Ever Lost. Everything you have ever lost is in here. How the lines on your face were written. How you could not afford your own face. How your face was a battlefield, a war between parents. How your pockets were tunnels and you were lost in them. How no one came, even though you called all night. How your call was the sound of something small breaking. How your teeth were tower blocks in which only white ghosts lived. How your skin was a lost birth certificate. How your birth certificate was proof of your death. How they stole your smile to store on a high supermarket shelf. How the industry unmade you. How your tongue was a conveyor belt and you could not make the words fast enough. How your soul was kept well fed in a zoo. How the zoo was a library of lost souls. How the soul stared on blinking from behind glass enclosures. How the glass was etched with the hieroglyphics of rage. How you made an origami figure of a small boy staring. How some boys cry with their fists. How some boys hang themselves from the thin edges of their smiles. How they told you that white was the colour that contained all others. How your skin became a colour that contained you. How skin becomes insignia. Everything you have ever lost is in here. How they spat at you, and the saliva became a sea, and you sailed easily across it to the other side of your heart. How your heart was a tectonic plate. How your heart rubbed, how it drifted apart. How other people set up home on the opposite side of your heart to you. How they sent smoke signals, how you answered, how your words turned to ash and blew away. How your voice was thin ice. You were afraid to walk across. How silence was a song your enemy taught you. How you took the last bus home to another man's city. How home keeps moving. How your streets were gentrified. How they gentrified our stages. How we were forced out of our own mouths. How you were raped, son, by a high court judge. How judges' wigs are mushroom clouds floating over the horizon. How your dreams were trained to walk in tight circles. How your dreams were dogs. How your father was a bomb and your mother rich in minerals. How you were dead, Tom. How you were dead, son. And death brought you flowers and you said, thank you, but you meant. How death waited outside all night. How pebbles against windows sound like Aleppo. How your mouth was a tornado that drew the whole town to it. You have ever lost is in here. When you could have let love sit beside you on a broken back sofa and changed the channels. When maybe only one hand was required, when perhaps if you'd placed your palm prints beside each other, you might have found that they made an atlas that could have led you out of here, and love could have woken you, and you could have fallen. And through falling, uncovered the archaeology of your wings, when after the grey apocalypse that no one else noticed, you might have realized trees hold hands beneath the earth. How you learn to hold hands beneath the earth. Everything you have ever lost is here. Here is the music of your brother's breathing. Here is the shape of your mother. Here is the shadow that abandoned you. Here is your unfound song. Here is the legend of your lost tongue. Here are your teeth, your bristle, your bone. Everything you have ever lost, it's here, and I've come to bring you home. Thank you.
All this week doing these events, I have found myself with a lump in my throat and struggled to carry on speaking. And because this has been so extraordinary and fascinating this morning, I have done a bad thing. I have got to the end of the time and not let you ask your questions. I'm sorry about that. But we will all be going to the signing tent, and if there are things you want to ask us, I'm sure all three of my panelists will be here to answer your questions. Can I just ask that at the end of this, you let us leave the tent before you so we can get to the signing tent first. At the end of this, I would like to thank my panelists here, Danny Dorling, Geetha Marcus, Joelle Taylor. And I would like to also thank the OU Scotland, the Open University in Scotland, whose work does so much to mitigate the social inequalities caused by homelessness and so many other wonderful things to make education available to people who have been denied it in one shape or form. So please thank everybody.